Here we go.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Green Drinks. We're so glad you're joining us, and come on back. If you're just joining us, welcome to Green Drinks. We're going to start in just a minute. Be right with you. All right. Well, I hope you're back because I can't wait. Welcome to Green Drinks. My name's Katie Breckheimer, and I'm your host this evening. And joining me are Cassidy Dunaway and Danny Bernstein. And we're just delighted that you're sharing an hour of this beautiful fall Thursday with us. And I'm here and excited to be here. And I'm going to turn it over to Cassidy, who's just going to help us navigate online. I know most of you are Zoom hardy, but there might be some who really don't understand how this works. So Cassidy, would you just tell us how this webinar platform works?
So nice to, well, not see everybody, but I see that there's 26 of you so far. We're getting there.
Great.
So when you show up, I unfortunately cannot see your wonderful faces, but you can type in questions into the Q&A box below, which looks like somebody already said hi, Katie, in it. So feel free to write your questions down below, and then when we get towards the end of the presentation, I will be reading off the questions to Danny so that we can get going on that. So if you have any issues, just let us know.
Great, thank you. So the plan for the evening is for me to talk a little bit about who we are and who's coming up. And then I'll introduce our speaker, Danny Bernstein, who's gonna talk to us about her new book, DuPont Forest History. We encourage you to write in those questions if something comes to you, and we'll get to them. Green Drinks is sponsored locally by Mountain True and Conserving Carolina, the best environmental nonprofits in Western North Carolina. And if you're not members, you need to take care of that. Join us. We're gonna remain virtual, so it just breaks my heart because I love seeing you guys. And one of the nice things about Green Drinks is community, but we gotta stay safe. So we're going to finish out our monthly series of Green Drinks through this year online. And we'll be back together soon. I'm sure we will. So what is Green Drinks? We are actually an international movement where people all over the world get together and talk about and learn about the environment and network. And we are one of 500 chapters across the world that get together and do this. So before we begin, I want to tell you a little bit about what's coming up. On November 12th, we are hosting the French Broad River Keeper, Hartwell Carson, who will report on the state of the river. Mountain True does a lot of water quality work, trying to keep these great resources clean and safe for all of us. We're members of the Waterkeeper Alliance and house 4 river keepers who keep their eyes on the Broad River, the Green River, the Watauga River, as well as the French Broad. On December 10th, Christine Whitmire, Henderson County's Environmental Program Manager, will talk to us about local recycling. Her title is What Can and Can't Be Recycled and Why? And we'll talk a little bit about the future of composting in the county. And what's exciting is our county and its partners recently received a federal grant to improve local composting options. And Christine wrote the grant. She's wonderful, and she can answer our questions. So if you have some, that's the time to Zoom in. That'll be December 10th. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Danny Bernstein. Danny is a hiker, a hike leader, and a writer. Today, she'll be introducing her new book, DuPont Forest, A History. Danny's written 2 other books, both hiking guides of the Southern mountain regions, Southern Appalachian regions. And in her previous life, she worked as a computer scientist, and that was even before computers were cool. So she was a software developer and then a professor of computer science. Her motto is, and I love this, and I hope you will too, no place is too far to walk if you have enough time. Okay, Danny, you're on.
Okay, well, what a wonderful introduction, Katie and Cassidy. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And it's also an honor to be read, since there are so many books out there. My memoir of DuPont Forest, it's a memoir as much as a history, not a my memoir, it's a memoir of the forest, because so much of the story that I'm going to tell is based on people's memory. And Cassidy is in charge of my slides, so maybe we can start to find out, for the few people who may not know, where DuPont Forest is. Okay, maybe we can.
Whoops. Sorry about that. I have to hit present. There we go.
Okay, so let's look at the second slide, please. And DuPont is in southwestern North Carolina between Asheville and Greenville. And if you're local, I will say it is between Hendersonville and Brevard. So let's look a little bit as to what the forest looks like. Next slide, please. You can't see anything here, I know, but what I would like you to focus on, because I'll get back to it, is that gray area. And that gray area says authorized people or authorized only. There is a lot of stuff in DuPont that makes it so attractive. And instead of going through chapter and verse, I created a little video. So let's look at it. It's only a minute and a half, so hang in there. Would there be sound? Well, no sound, huh? Okay. Maybe you want to go where the sound is and see if you can increase it. Okay, well, it's almost done anyway. It has a lot of very unusual things, but it also does have flowers. And okay, the donut hole is an area I will come back to.
They're beautiful slides.
Well, thank you.
I'm not missing the music. I'm okay with it.
Okay, all right. And DuPont is a multi-use forest, hikers and bikers, and it's a little stuck.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. And horses and a lot of other things, but those are the main constituents of DuPont Forest. Okay, thank you. We can go back, we can close out YouTube and go back to my slideshow if possible. Okay, why don't we just leave it here for a second? Okay. So you may wonder why I wrote the book. So we can go to the next slide. And if you go to High Falls, which is one of 6 waterfalls in DuPont, everybody's looking at the waterfall. But the first time I was there, I turned around and I noted this chimney. I know there are a lot of chimneys in the Smokies, heaps of chimneys. And of course, this woman wasn't there. And the first time I went, I was with Carolina Mountain Club. I moved to the area in 2001, joined CMC from the very beginning, and started asking questions. Now, this chimney is part of the history of Buck Forest Lodge. But the lodge was kind of a latecomer in the history. So let's look at the next slide. It was built in 1941 when Frank Cox, who was the main owner, half of DuPont Forest, of the land, what is now DuPont Forest, built a hunting lodge. And this woman that you saw was a child who came there with her family. And that was one of the wows. I had met a lot of DuPont employees, but I had never met anybody who was there before the company. But even Buck Forest was a latecomer. Let's go to the next slide. And there are Cherokee petroglyphs on the trail. This is Big Rock Trail, and this is not a black and white picture. This is a color pictures, but that's what you're getting. And these are scratched, mostly circles, not painted, on one of the trails. And so let's look at the next slide. When the settlers, or not exactly the settler, when they were already, was already photography, and this is crossing High Falls. Most of us know High Falls because there's a bridge, a covered bridge there. But that was also a very late addition. Let's continue to Thomas Cemetery. The next slide, please. Micaiah Thomas was the first person that we know who was born in DuPont Forest. And this is a family cemetery, and he and a lot of Thomases are buried there. So the cemeteries tell you that there was life way before us there. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that before Buck Forest Lodge, there was a hotel. And this hotel was built before the Civil War by Micaiah Thomas, who was quite an entrepreneur. And if you go to the next slide, please, you can see that there's another cemetery called the Hooker Moore Cemetery. And that is all on one part of the forest. But there's another whole northern part called Guion Farms, if we want to go to the next slide. And Guion, by the way, who was the engineer and construction person who built Pardee Hospital, and many of you know Pardee Hospital, bought about half of what became DuPont Forest. And he had a farm there. And before that, ice cream, there was a farm and there were cows and they made ice cream. So in 1956, there were 2 major landowners, Cox, who had built the Buck Forest Lodge, and Guion, Alex Guion. And they weren't really looking to sell it, but DuPont Corporation came knocking. And let's go to the next slide. And they were looking for a place with fresh air, and good water. And the story, the way I see it, is how we got the land from these two men through to DuPont Corporation to now. And the book kind of blends the description of the past and present. And I've got interviews and on hiking narratives, because I am fascinated by how we get our public land. Obviously, we get it from private sources. And here, so it was relatively doable to see how we got this land. So DuPont Corporation buys 10,000 acres of land. And next slide, because they are going to manufacture silicon. You know, for silicon chips, this was the late 1950s. And at that time, the technology required good water, good air, and they found it in Cedar Mountain. If we go to the next slide, you'll see this technician who is picking out silicon.
Hey, Danny, can I interrupt you just for a second?
Of course.
How did you write this? How did you write this book?
How did I write this book? I started by talking to a lot of people. So I learned very quickly that several of my CMC hiking colleagues were DuPont retirees. And I started talking to them. And started talking to them on the trail, but I can't do it that way. I've had to go and sit down, take them to lunch, someplace in either Hendersonville or Brevard, and talk. And one person led to another. And it started out with DuPont retirees, yes. But I then interviewed North Carolina legislators, Forest Service people, hikers, equestrian. I'm a hiker, so I need to talk to bikers and horse people to look at their perspective. So what I'd like to do is I would like to read an interview from what I think was one of the most fascinating person that I talked to. His name is Earl Johnson, and he is 95 years old, lives in Brevard, is very, very sharp, and he was the first engineer to come from New Jersey, where they had a small silicon, like an experimental area, and so that he was the first one to be brought to Brevard. I was sent to New Jersey. Now, this was before, the guy's 95, right? So he had career way before he came to Brevard. The DuPont operation wasn't open yet, but they needed expertise in maintenance and purification, and that was his area. DuPont had real estate scouts who looked up and down the East Coast for a place away from industry. And this is where they bought this land, because there wasn't much manufacturing in the area. And he was married and he had 3 children then, and he moved to Brevard. And being married was an advantage, as men moved with the company from location to location. And we're just talking about men, okay? A woman was supposed to make a home wherever the family landed. In the late 50s, early 60s, women were only hired for the usual clerical jobs. And they weren't bringing women from any place else. They were all local. And he was in charge of purification. And one of the interesting things he remembers is the first year, the pipes at the plant froze. They weren't insulated properly because the people who built the first building thought they were building a plant in the South. Well, we're not in the South, we're in Appalachia. So the temperature went to -20. And I'm telling him, no, -20 here? So sure enough, I look up the National Water and Climate Center and it says in winter, the average temperature is 38 degrees. Yes. But the lowest temperature on record, which occurred at Brevard, was in 1958, where it was minus 20. And 1958 was the first year of DuPont's operation. You know, they came in 56 and they had to build a plant. So when I read that, I said, okay, to myself, okay, the rest of his recollections were going to be, I was reliable as well. So another thing about Earl Johnson, because of his age, is he was the only one that I could ask outright, was there segregation at DuPont in the late 50s? And he says, of course there was segregation at the plant. Les Grogan, the plant manager who came from New Jersey, wasn't happy about it, but he had to go along. So they built a plant with 2 sets of everything. And I couldn't get that kind of information from others. Either they pretended they had amnesia, but most of the time, most of the other people came in the 70s. And so Johnson says, I couldn't understand segregation, but those were the rules. He followed the practices of Augusta, the other large plant in Pennsylvania County. Augusta had been there since 1939, and their motto was, what's good for Brevard is good for Augusta. And which is a perfect segue to the next slide, if I may. By 1962, they realized that silicon was not going to make them any money. There was too many other companies making it. So they switched to making X-ray film, and they had to retool everything. And that's when segregation disappeared. So this is the book, by the way, DuPont Forest. So when they moved to X-ray film, this was medical film. Mammograms were starting to become something that average woman was starting to do. So there was a large market for that. Let's go to the next slide, if I may. X-ray, one of the interesting things I learned is how they made X-ray film. You can read about it in the book, okay? But this was done in the light, and that's why they've got these pictures. Now, I obviously didn't take these pictures. These came from a corporate library. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that one thing they couldn't control was the roads. And they were getting a lot of their supplies from outside, most of their supplies from outside the area. So there were a few mishaps. 276 is very, very curvy, still is. And some of these trucks didn't quite make it. One of the things I learned talking to all of these employees, oh, by the way, I also interviewed children of DuPont employees, which of course by now are not children. They're in their 50s, 60s, even 70s. Earl Johnson's daughter is in her early 70s. It's what a country club this place was. So let's go to the next picture. This is Lake DERA, DuPont Employee Recreation Area. And there are 5 lakes that we can all go to. This one, yet you can't yet. And so let's continue to the next slide. It was like a campus, picnics, baseball fields, and you can see a lot of the remains of that. And it wasn't just employees that had this 10,000 acres. Locals, if you filled out the right form, could go there, and you know, church groups and all, and enjoy the waterfalls. Now, at the same time, if we can go to the next slide or so, there was a summer camp next door called the Summit Camps. And it was a regular summer camp. As you know, there were a lot of summer camps in the area. And it started in the 60s, I believe. And you still see some of the remains of that. The Girls' Lodge, the old infirmary, which is now the ranger station. And let's go to the next slide, please. And this one really kills me. This was the girls' dining hall. And when I came to the area, and for several years later, it just was falling apart. Beautiful building. And I was so glad that I was able to take all these pictures, because now it's the Forest Service has taken it down. You know, if they don't have a use for it, they're not going to just maintain it. So the summer camps built Lake Julia. If we can go to the next slide, please. I mean, what's a camp without a lake, right? And 99-acre lake for swimming and boating, which you can still do. You can swim, you can boat if you're willing to carry your kayak there. And lots of other things. If we can go to the next slide, that's an airstrip. Now I'll let you read the book as to how we got this airstrip, but that was not DuPont, that was the camp. And I believe there's one more slide of what they left us, the horse barn. This was by 1986, Ben Cart, who was the owner of the summer camps, was ready to move on to another business. And after a lot of negotiations, DuPont Corporation bought that. So expanding their footprint and again, controlling their neighbors. So I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but if we go to the next slide, 1995, DuPont Corporation announces they're leaving. They're going to sell the plant. They're going to do something. And a couple of people, a couple of employees, one in particular, Jeff Jennings, went right away to Carolina Mountain Lane Conservancy and explained the situation. And to make a long story a little shorter, DuPont sold at bargain basement prices about 7,000 acres to the state, which left another about 3,000 acres. And that's where all the drama came in, which I will let you read about. So I would like to, and these waterfalls, these three main waterfalls were saved. So let's move on to the next slide, because now, the way I'm telling the story, we have a forest. Not quite. Remember that gray area that, and I called it the donut hole? DuPont isn't quite out of the forest. So why don't we go to the next slide? After they sold the plant, and they sold the plant at 2002, AGFA, the last owner, said, we're closing. They've consolidated their film, and there were all these buildings there. And by then, AGFA, the last owner, only had like 450 acres of land, just where the plant is. And that is what is called the donut hole, because it's this little piece that doesn't have public access yet. And this is Chet, who is, we call him the last man standing. He's the last person who is working for DuPont affiliate, and he manages the cleanup. So he showed me this demolition contract, when they when they started taking the buildings down. You know, this checklist, but it wasn't a checklist. There was 3 huge binders, and all the buildings are gone now. But still, DuPont is still cleaning up. Let's go to the next slide, because I love this slide. I don't know how much you guys can see, but right now there are lots of solid waste management units, and they buried stuff, and they know exactly what's there, and they're cleaning all of this up. But this is you see Lake DERA, but this is one of the maps within the donut hole of what they're cleaning up. And several years ago, DuPont donated that last bit to the state, but they're still in there. And they will be in there until EPA and the Department of Environmental Quality and God knows what other groups say it's done. And then the state forest is going to have to decide how they want to use this. Right now, if you go there, and I was very privileged to have a tour by Chet, it's essentially concrete with a lot of weeds coming up, because that's where the plant was, that's where the huge parking lots were, and we're talking 18 years. And it is also where the movies, the base where all of these famous movies were filmed. I'll just throw out 2 of them, because the Last of the Mohicans in 1992 was, well, DuPont Corporation was still there, and you know, they filmed using the waterfalls. But you don't want to hear about the Last of the Mohicans. What you want to hear about is the Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games was filmed, again, the base of it was at the, was in the donut hole. That's where Jennifer Lawrence had her mobile home and all the other famous stars. And from there, they went to the waterfalls. And they also used the airstrip in a very clever way, which I'll let you read in the book. So that brings us up essentially to the present. Katie, was there other questions you wanted to ask me?
So that's the last slide. Oh, that was.
Well, it's not the last slide, but let's.
Well, I was so into it. I was ready for the next slide. No, I want to know what was the most surprising thing you found.
In fact, let's move on to the next slide so that we're not staring at this map that nobody can see. The man to the left is Jason. He is the supervisor. He's the forest supervisor, and forest supervisor is what they call in parks, they call him superintendents, but it's the same thing. He is the head guy, and he's meeting some hikers. The most surprising thing I learned, or I found, is nobody had written a book about this before. And if you compare it to the Smokies, for example, there are hundreds of books about the Smokies and the Blue Ridge Parkway, but nobody had written a book. The other thing I found was very surprising was DuPont Corporation. I found a few memos. There wasn't much written about that I could get a hand. You know, I did talk to people in Wilmington, Delaware. That's the headquarters. And they said, whatever you can find in Brevard, that's it. And thank goodness for the Transylvania County Library. They were wonderful. And I did find what I thought was a fascinating memo, which essentially says DuPont was wondering what to do with the land from almost the beginning. So let me, if I can find it easily, let me read a little bit. Okay, here we go. So in 1962, now that a whole new set of people come in, and the head of the plant writes this large memo wondering what the company should do with this thousands of acres. A question remained, what can and should be done with the thousands of acres of property in excess of present and forecast photo products needs, you know, the x-rays. This pertinent question soon strikes every new technical supervisory transferee from our more confined plants in the Northeast. Morrison, the plant manager, took this question seriously, and he spent many hours traversing and inspecting the property. Previous owners had built some trails. The timber company had added to the network of trails. So, well, lots of things could happen. They could sell everything other than what they needed for the plant, but he didn't like that. He was very concerned about neighbors. To Morrison, land boundaries were fixed and unalterable. To the neighbors around DuPont, boundaries were a little more fluid. People locally may have been more accustomed to hunting and fishing on private land. But now there were hard property lines and the staff to enforce it. Controlling trespassers and poachers seemed to be a constant headache. And also wondering what to do with this land, and he wanted to make it pay for itself. And he did what any good engineer did. He bought expertise, and he hired somebody from Pisgah Forest to manage the trees, the land around the plant. So that was another very surprising thing. And the third thing is all this information was public. There was nothing I used that was private, because what good is that, right? If you can't write about it. And you know, the forest is so new that people in the book are probably on this call.
Danny?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
What do you think would have happened to it if DuPont hadn't bought it in the first place?
Well, you know, that's a very good question, because that occurred to me after several interviews. And I actually asked every person, that was kind of my last question, every person I interviewed. So let me throw out a few things. I imagine that the land will look much like all of the mountainous land in Transylvania County. If you look at the aerial photos of the land of the waterfalls, lots of private homes, occasional farms. And somebody says, you know, there would be a small series of housing developments in the 1970s. Now, these owners were not dying to sell, but they could be convinced with the right amount of cash. And, you know, I think the agreement was it never would have been a state forest without DuPont Corporation buying the land. It would be summer camps, trailer parks, development. But one person said in 1956, it wasn't that easy to sell this quantity of land. There were no roads or infrastructure. Now, yeah, sure, by the 1970s, developers would have come in to build on the site. Summer camps and church retreats were popular in Western North Carolina, but they don't use that much land. So there was one housing development, Sherwood Forest, in Transylvania County that was created in 1957. and that's 1,000 acres, and it's pretty big. Now remember, the segregated South of the 1950s was not the attractive area that it is now. So those large landowners, which probably have sat on that land for a long time. But I think everybody agreed it would not have been what we have now. Are there any questions from the audience?
Cassidy, have you got anything?
Don't look like we have anything as of yet.
Well, one says, hi, Katie.
Hey, everybody. Well, we've got time. If you want to continue, Danny, I bet people will come up with something. Okay.
I do see one question. Where is the airstrip on that map? First of all, if you're going to go any place in DuPont Forest, please get a real map, a National Geographic map. If you come in through the Fawn Lake entrance and you walk on Conservation Road, I don't know, a half mile, maybe, or maybe a little bit more, the airstrip will cross Conservation Road. And the airstrip itself is a mile. You can walk on it, you can bike it, I guess you horseback ride too. It's pretty broken up by now. The Forest Service still uses it for emergencies, but it's helicopter only, not small planes. When it was built for private planes. Well, we got a couple more slides if there aren't any other, or there are a couple more questions. Okay, that's more important, Cassidy. Go ahead.
I see them.
I saw one from Lynn Killian, who was asking if you get into the Jim Anthony story in your book.
I sure do. What I found interesting when I came to DuPont, Western North Carolina, remember that this was 2001. So by then the Jim Anthony land was condemned. So we had an intact forest other than the donut hole. And that's all I heard about was these three, how these three waterfalls were saved, which is a wonderful story. I mean, after all, I got to leave something for you guys to buy the book, right? And again, this is so new that many of the people who protested and organized and talked to legislators to save the waterfalls from development are still around. So I certainly do get into the Jim Anthony story, and I was lucky enough to not just meet locals who did that, but also people from Raleigh, from the North Carolina state government. Now, I didn't interview Jim Hunt, no, but some of the people who worked for him at the time. So yes, I do.
So yeah, there are some lovely interviews in the book. I was so glad that you mentioned Aline Steinberg and Chuck McGrady and Jeff Jennings. They're all in there, folks. So she's teasing you a little bit because she's got some she wants you to buy, and Malaprops is right, Danny, you can?
You can buy it at Malaprops. You could buy it at Highland Books in Brevard. So if you live in that area, please support your local bookstore. And of course, you can buy it online. So if you're, though Malaprops and Highland Books will ship it any place. But thank you for the plug, Katie.
You bet. Yeah, no, don't go to Amazon if you can get it locally, folks. You guys know that.
Right.
So it looks like
Cassidy, anything else?
yeah, I've got a couple more questions that just popped up.
Okay, great.
So one of them says, do you see DuPont Forest State Park growing with additional land being added from Henderson and or Transylvania counties?
Okay, could you repeat that very slowly?
Yes. Says, do you see DuPont Forest State Park growing with additional land?
Okay, I thought I heard you say that. This is a very sore point. It is not a park. It is a forest. So I would just like to, I don't know who, so I would just like to correct it, that it's a state forest. At the time that they had all this land, they did approach the state park system, but state parks was already working on another state park at the time. We're talking about the late 1990s. And so the Forest Service took it over. Why is that important? Well, first of all, it's because it's a forest. And people don't know the difference until you start seeing logging. And there is very minimal, but there is hunting in DuPont, because after all, it's a forest. And as far as growing, absolutely. You know that between the time I finished my manuscript and sent it off to the publisher, the History Press, and the time I got it back with correction, we had gotten another piece of land. So forest is growing. Various organizations and extended families are selling land at bargain basement prices, or in some cases giving it away. We the forest, just got a nice piece of the Continental Divide. And, but these pieces, they're protected, they're part of the forest, but they're not open to the public because the Forest Service, North Carolina Forest Service, has to figure out what to do with them and has to inventory them for various endangered species. Are they going to put trails? Are they just going to leave it there? We don't have to be walking on every single bit of land that's being saved. But yes, it's happening. If you got land if you got land adjacent to DuPont, consider donating it.
And contacting a Carolina Mountain Land Conservancy.
There you go.
Have been big players in this, and we're so grateful.
So I have a couple more questions if you're still willing to take them.
Absolutely.
So
you're gonna have to throw me off, you know.
Says, when the property was first transferred to the state, what was the reaction from the surrounding community at the time? Was it welcome? If not, how has that opinion changed?
I do not know how what the community said when the 7,000 acres was transferred. I do know that the employees, they were already retirees, right? Retirees all the time, were very happy because it meant that they could keep fishing and they could keep hunting. So actually, I do know, because now that I think about it, the first section of land was welcomed by everybody. And as like Chuck McGrady said, who was another legislator that I interviewed, it was like singing Kumbaya. Everybody was happy. DuPont Corporation did not ask for it to be named for them, but it just, according to Chuck, it just seemed like the natural thing. It wasn't that clear cut when the second section was taken, and when we saved the waterfalls, because there were going to be some construction jobs if Jim Anthony built houses. So there was more of a divided community in 2000 than there was in 1997.
Well, before you go on, Cassidy, I was reprimanded.
Abe was there.
For my slip No, I said, I didn't say Conserving Carolina, which is the new and accepted name of our local land trust that's doing all this work. I slipped into the old name. I'm sorry.
Well, no, Carolina Mountain Land Conservancy that turned into Conserving Carolina was there from the very beginning. They the ones, yay. When Jeff Jennings, the engineer, came to them, they're the ones who then went to the Conservation
Fun.
Which is a national organization that had the money to buy the land from DuPont Corporation. But they were there from the very, and they're still involved in the forest.
So the next question just says, how long did it take to write?
That's always a question. And I asked that too of other authors. I would like to say the end is very easy. The end is when my manuscript was due and there was a deadline. You know, this was not an airy fairy thing. You work with the history press. They're wonderful to work with, but if you sign a contract, there is a deadline. So the deadline was easy. It was April 2000, this April. And thank goodness I had gotten everything done before the pandemic shut everything down, because the state forest was closed, the library was closed, but at that point I was just editing, etc. So that was, yes, is right. I started interviewing the first person, a real sit-down interview, I would say April 2018. And so I would say 2 years. Now, that doesn't mean 5 days a week, 40 hours a week. I have other responsibilities. I think of leading hikes and all these other things I do as, quote, my day job. So it took me 2 years, but, and I didn't realize I had a book until probably last fall, the end of the summer, when I was confident enough to approach the history press with a proposal. And they took it, so here we are, but there was a deadline. 2 years, let's call it 2 years.
So the next question reads, the picture that you showed of the plant, was that how the plant in the donut hole looked? Looks amazingly big with lots of roads and concrete.
Yes, that was a picture where I said they came in 56. That was a picture that I got from the Transylvania County Library. They have a lot of photographs. So it was very big. Yes, at the height, there were 1,500 people working there. It was, some people say it was like a small city. They had their own medical people. They had their own water system, etc. So yes.
Next one says, any new development on the Cascade Lake campground?
They've got a Facebook page. Cascade Lake was private, was always private. Cascade Lake and the campground was always private. So when the owners decided they were out of that business, from what I can tell, and I was there, it's just there. And so unless somebody buys it, maybe the questioner can buy it and open it up. It's sitting there. So I don't know any more than that, I'm afraid. And I understand what the person is asking, because there is no campground in DuPont Forest. You can't camp there. It's too small. Even with all these additions, it's only 12,000 acres. If you have trouble figuring out what 12,000 acres is, Great Smoky Mountains National Park is over 500,000 acres, over 500,000. So 12,000 for a forest is pretty small.
The next one reads, once the state decides what to do with the donut hole, could you interview them to write a short DuPont, the future?
Oh, I would love that. But Jason, the supervisor, whenever you talk to him, a few more years. So they are not committing themselves. And, you know, as far as they're concerned, I am the public. So I don't think they're going to tell me anything they're not going to tell you or any other reporter. And there isn't a plan yet. And probably there isn't a plan partly, and this is just me, because they have no idea when the land is going to be released. You know, it's owned. The Forest Service has it. That's not in question. But everybody agrees they're not going to do anything until the company leaves.
Can I just put in a plug for the Friends of DuPont Forest, a wonderful advocacy group that does such a fine job of overseeing and kind of looking out for the park. And they've been around for quite a while, and they need members, they need funds, and Sarah Landry, their director, is wonderful. So I do encourage those people who can to join the Friends of DuPont Forest.
Thank you, Katie. In my excitement to tell you everything, I've forgotten to mention Friends of DuPont Forest. I became a member. You know, when I write about something, the first thing I do is become a member of the organization. And so I became a member quite a while back. And yeah, they are, besides having a wonderful trail crew that keeps the trails in the great shape they are, they also, before the pandemic, had these wonderful Saturday morning workshops. Just to give you an example, you know those petroglyphs? I have been on that trail so many times before. I never noticed the petroglyphs until there was a Saturday workshop on it, and the lecturer, there was a classroom in back of the visitor center. So it was an hour of classroom, and then we went to actually see the petroglyphs. Like, so there were a lot of wonderful workshops, and I am sure as soon as they can physically, they will go back to having them, and they're for members only. So join. Thank you.
I have
I
one
think
last question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It just says, do you think user fees will be instituted in order to use the forest?
Well, right now as we speak, there is a commission that is studying user fees. Actually, even setting up the commission was something that the state legislators had to do. And they are due back with a report in August, next August. And what they're doing, based on everything I read, was they're looking at other state parks, because, you know, it's a state forest, but it is a recreational state forest. The first one in North Carolina. So they're kind of a little hybrid. And they're also looking at how state parks in South Carolina are managed, because they almost all charge fees. But once they come up with a recommendation, it has to go back to the state legislator and comments. So don't pull out your wallet yet. And then when it happens, the Forest Service has to decide how they're going to do this. There are 5 entrances, access areas, they call them. They're going to have rangers at every one of them. Personally, I doubt it. It's probably going to be the main one, but they're going to have to figure out how it's done. So it's going to be a while. But yes, I see it eventually. Eventually, I just don't know when it is.
Right. All right, folks, I think it's time. We need to keep our time to an hour. It's been great. We could talk to Danny all day, but do come back next month for Hartwell Carson, the French Broad River Keeper. And thank you, Danny, and thank you, Cassidy, and everyone who is out there.
And thank you. Thank you so much. It was really fun. And get out there, folks.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.